The biting wind, sharp as a shard of prairie glass, whipped Elara Vance's auburn hair across her face, stinging her eyes and tasting of the endless, untamed expanse that stretched before her. It was a wind that carried the scent of dust, of sagebrush, and of a future as uncertain as the shifting sands of a desert dune. She clutched the worn leather reins of her mule, aptly named Patience, tighter, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. Beside her, tied securely to the saddle, was her sole worldly possession beyond the clothes on her back and the meager provisions in her saddlebags. A rolled-up deed, its parchment brittle with age, promising ownership of a place no one else seemed to want. Her destination lay some miles further, a smudge on the horizon that might, with a generous stretch of the imagination, be mistaken for a cluster of buildings. This was Redemption Creek, a town whose name seemed a cruel jest given the desolation surrounding it. The deed, inherited from a distant, almost forgotten relative, spoke of a cabin, a parcel of land, and the vague hope of a fresh start. A fresh start was precisely what Elara craved, a desperate yearning that had propelled her from the suffocating familiarity of a life she couldn't bear to endure any longer. The memory of the shadowed rooms, the whispered judgments, and the suffocating weight of expectations she could never meet still clung to her like the dust of the road. As she drew closer, the smudge resolved into a handful of weathered wooden structures huddled together, as if for warmth against the relentless elements. A saloon, its swinging doors ajar, beckoned with the promise of noise and distraction, though Elara suspected its offerings would be of a kind she'd rather avoid. A general store, its porch sagging, displayed a meager assortment of goods that spoke volumes about the town's limited resources. And then, a little further out, perched on a slight rise overlooking the parched creek bed, was the object of her weary pilgrimage, a cabin, or rather what remained of one. Even from a distance, its state of disrepair was palpable. The roof sagged precariously, a patchwork of missing shingles and warped wood. The walls, once perhaps a cheerful hue, were now faded and splintered, bearing the scars of countless seasons. One window was boarded up, another gaped like a missing tooth, and the door, ajar on its rusted hinges, seemed to sag with an air of profound defeat. It was a structure that whispered of abandonment, of a life that had long since flickered out. It was, in essence, a broken thing. A knot of apprehension tightened in Elara's stomach. This was the inheritance? This skeletal frame exposed to the unforgiving elements. Doubt, a familiar and unwelcome companion, began to gnaw at her resolve. Had she been foolish? Had she traded one form of hardship for another, perhaps even more isolating? Patience, sensing her rider's unease, let out a low, sympathetic snort. "It's something, isn't it, girl?" Elara murmured, stroking the mule's coarse mane. Not exactly the grand estate the old stories hinted at. She dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride. The silence here was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling lazily overhead. There was no welcoming committee, no friendly face to offer assistance. This was the frontier, a place where one was largely expected to fend for oneself. She walked towards the cabin, her boots crunching on the dry earth. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of decay and the faint, lingering aroma of wood smoke, a ghostly reminder of occupants long gone. She pushed the door open further, wincing at the shriek of tortured metal. The interior was a tableau of neglect. Dust lay thick on every surface, a velvety blanket obscuring the rough-hewn floorboards. Cobwebs, spun by generations of industrious spiders, draped from the rafters like macabre decorations. A rusted cast-iron stove stood in the corner, its firebox cold and empty. A rickety table and a single, equally unsteady chair were the only concessions to furniture. The fireplace was choked with debris, its hearth cold and lifeless. Yet amidst the desolation, Elara's gaze began to settle on the details. The sturdy beams supporting the roof, though aged, were still sound. The stone foundation, though weathered, held firm. The very bones of the cabin, despite their neglect, spoke of a fundamental resilience. It was broken, yes, but it was not beyond repair. A flicker of something akin to hope, small and fragile, ignited within her. This was her starting point. This was the canvas upon which she would paint a new life. The task ahead was monumental, a mountain of labor that seemed to loom larger with every gust of wind. But as she stood there, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom, Elara Vance made a silent vow. She would not be broken by this place. She would mend it. She would build a home here, and in doing so, she would build herself. The journey had begun, not with a grand arrival, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the ruin and the nascent determination to reclaim it. The silence of the cabin was not empty. It was a charged stillness, pregnant with the task Elara faced. She spent the first day simply assessing the damage, her senses absorbing the profound neglect. The scent of mildew and damp earth, the chill that emanated from the stone walls even under the midday sun, the sheer quantity of dust that coated every surface. It was an overwhelming inventory of decay. Yet, with each observation, a strange sense of purpose solidified within her. This was not just a structure, it was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down by fate, and Elara was determined to pick it up. Her first priority was clearing the debris. Armed with a rudimentary broom fashioned from bundled twigs she found outside and a shovel from her meager supplies, she began the painstaking work of excavating the cabin from its dusty shroud. Each sweep of the broom raised plumes of fine grit that settled back down moments later. A Sisyphean task that tested her patience more than anything she had ever known. She worked with a focused intensity, channeling her frustration and her anxieties into the physical exertion. The dust, she reasoned, was just the manifestation of years of neglect. It could be swept away. Hours later, sweat trickled down her temples, and her arms ached with a deep, satisfying soreness. The immediate floor area around the entrance was somewhat clearer, revealing the rough-hewn planks beneath. She discovered a small lidded wooden chest tucked away in a shadowy corner, its hinges rusted shut. With considerable effort and a sturdy piece of fallen timber, she managed to pry it open. Inside, nestled amongst more dust and a few desiccated leaves, were a handful of tarnished tin cups, a single chipped enamel plate, and a small, surprisingly well-preserved diary, its leather cover cracked, but its pages intact. This felt like a small victory, a tangible connection to the cabin's past, and a potential source of knowledge. Her next focus was the gaping fireplace. It was choked with the remnants of old fires, ash, and what appeared to be animal nesting material. Carefully, using her shovel and hands protected by thick, worn gloves, she began to excavate. The work was slow and arduous, each shovelful of debris feeling heavier than the last. She unearthed shards of pottery, a bent metal poker, and a surprisingly intact iron kettle blackened with age. As she cleared the hearth, a draft of fresher air began to circulate, and she could almost feel the cabin exhaling, shedding a layer of its stagnant past. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, Elara paused, leaning against the doorframe. The landscape outside was stark, beautiful in its harshness. The wind had died down, leaving a profound quietude. She watched as the first stars began to prick the darkening canvas, their distant light a comforting presence. She was utterly alone, a single point of human endeavor in a vast, indifferent wilderness. Yet the ache in her muscles was a testament to her own strength, and the slightly less dusty cabin behind her represented a small but significant step forward. She decided to tackle the boarded-up window the following day. For now, she would make her bed on the floor, a thin blanket spread over the cleared space. She ate a simple meal of dried jerky and hardtack, the meager sustenance tasting like a feast after the day's labor. As she lay there listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin settling around her, she felt a fragile sense of peace. It was not comfort, not yet, but it was the quiet satisfaction of having faced the overwhelming and having taken the first, decisive steps. The dust was still there, the repairs were immense, but the dream of a home, however fragile, had begun to take root in the desolate soil of Redemption Creek. She had inherited dust and brokenness, but within it she had already found the first stirrings of her own resilience. The inhabitants of Redemption Creek were a hardy, weathered lot, their faces etched with the stories of sun, wind, and struggle. They were a community forged in isolation, where news traveled slowly and strangers were met with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Elara Vance, arriving in her dusty wagon pulled by a patient mule, was an anomaly. A lone woman, seeking to inhabit the derelict cabin on the edge of town, a place whispered to be cursed or at least thoroughly unlucky, was cause for considerable speculation. Her initial foray into town for essential supplies was met with a wall of quiet appraisal. The proprietor of the general store, a man named Silas with eyes as sharp as a hawk's, observed her with an unnervingly steady gaze as she purchased flour, salt, coffee, and a few other staples. His questions were polite but probing. "Passing through, ma'am?" he'd asked, his voice a low drawl. Elara, her own voice deliberately calm and measured, had replied, "I've come to settle. I've inherited the old McGregor place." Silas's eyebrows had flickered almost imperceptibly. "McGregor place, you say? Ain't been lived in for nigh on 10 years. Most folks reckon it's got a bad spirit about it." Elara had met his gaze directly. "I don't believe in bad spirits, Mr. Silas. I believe in hard work." Her response, firm and unyielding, seemed to both impress and discomfort him. He had provided her with her supplies, but the glances from other customers, lingering just a moment too long, told her that her arrival had stirred the quiet waters of Redemption Creek. Later, as she hitched Patience back to her wagon, she overheard snippets of conversation drifting from the saloon. "A woman? All alone? Out at the old McGregor place?" One voice grumbled. "Bad idea. That land's got a shadow over it." Another voice, lower and more cautious, replied, "She looked tough, though. Didn't flinch when Silas mentioned the stories." These whispers followed her like the dust she carried. Elara was accustomed to judgment, but this felt different. It wasn't just about her, it was about the cabin, the land, the unspoken history that seemed to cling to it. She found a small worn journal in the chest she'd opened in the cabin, and she began to read it by the flickering light of a candle she'd managed to procure. The entries, penned in a spidery hand by a previous occupant named Agnes McGregor, spoke of isolation, of harsh winters, and of a pervasive loneliness that had eventually driven her away. There were no supernatural occurrences, no ghosts, just the crushing weight of solitude and a harsh environment. Agnes's words reinforced Elara's belief that the bad spirit was simply the embodiment of hardship and despair. The following days were a blur of relentless labor. Elara focused on making the cabin habitable. She managed to reinforce the sagging roof with salvaged timbers and sturdy canvas, creating a temporary shield against the elements. She boarded up the gaping window more securely, using planks she'd found scattered around the property. She tackled the fireplace again, clearing it more thoroughly and discovering a loose stone that, when nudged, revealed a small hollow space behind it. Inside, she found a small collection of dried herbs, carefully bundled and tied, their scent still faintly aromatic. Agnes, it seemed, had been a woman of practical knowledge, a healer perhaps, who found solace in the land's bounty. One afternoon, while Elara was painstakingly scraping away layers of peeling paint from the interior walls, a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up, her heart giving a small, involuntary leap. Standing there was a man, tall and lean, silhouetted against the bright western sun. He wore the familiar garb of a cowboy, worn denim, a sweat-stained bandana, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring much of his face. He was a figure of quiet competence, his presence as solid and unyielding as the land itself. He didn't speak, simply observed her with an intensity that felt less like judgment and more like a detached assessment. Elara, wiping her dusty hands on her apron, stood her ground. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden flutter in her chest. The man's gaze swept over the cabin, lingering for a moment on the patched roof, the boarded window, and then finally settling on her. A hint of a wry smile touched his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just passing by," he said, his voice a low rumble, as rough and worn as saddle leather. "Heard tell someone was trying to tame this old place." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as they took in her dusty, tired appearance. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you." And then, with another quiet nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing as quickly as he had arrived, leaving Elara alone once more, the echo of his voice and the impression of his silent scrutiny lingering in the air. The whispers of the town had reached her ears, but now, it seemed, the wind itself carried new tales, tales that might soon include a solitary cowboy and his silent observation of her struggle. Elara's days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and her own unflagging will. The initial novelty of her arrival had worn off for the townsfolk, replaced by a quiet acceptance of her solitary presence on the outskirts. They still watched, of course. Curiosity was a vital currency on the frontier, and the woman attempting to resurrect the abandoned McGregor cabin was a subject of ongoing fascination. But the direct interactions remained minimal, mostly confined to her bi-weekly trips into Redemption Creek for supplies. Her focus remained resolutely inward, on the cabin and the small patch of land surrounding it. The real labor was unseen by the town. It was the painstaking process of clearing the overgrown weeds and brambles that threatened to swallow the cabin whole. It was the careful digging and turning of the soil in the small rectangular patch behind the cabin that she intended to become her garden. It was the constant patching and reinforcing of the cabin's structure, each task demanding her full attention and considerable physical effort. She found Agnes MacGregor's journal to be an invaluable companion. The faded ink chronicled not only the hardships, but also the small triumphs and practical wisdom of a woman who had lived and struggled on this very land. Agnes wrote of identifying edible plants, of methods for preserving food, of finding natural remedies for common ailments. Elara, armed with this knowledge, began to cautiously explore the surrounding scrubland. She learned to distinguish between the poisonous and the nourishing, her fingers becoming more adept at recognizing the subtle differences in leaf shapes and textures. The bundles of dried herbs she'd found behind the fireplace, Agnes noted, were a potent blend for aiding sleep and easing muscle aches, useful for a body engaged in constant toil. One afternoon, while trying to dislodge a stubborn, deeply rooted weed that threatened to undermine the cabin's foundation, Elara heard the distinct sound of hooves approaching. She braced herself, assuming it would be another townsman passing by, offering a gruff nod or perhaps a dismissive glance. Instead, the rider dismounted a respectful distance away and approached on foot. It was the cowboy from her first encounter, the one with the quiet intensity. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze assessing the work she was doing. He didn't offer platitudes or unsolicited advice. Instead, he simply said, "That's a tough root. Needs to be cut clean, low to the ground, or it'll just grow back stronger." Elara straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. "I've been trying. It feels like it's part of the earth itself." He knelt beside her, his movements economical and precise. From a pocket in his worn vest, he produced a small, sharp knife. "Here. Better for the job." He offered it to her. Elara accepted, the knife feeling cool and balanced in her hand. He then demonstrated, his movements fluid and efficient, how to make a clean cut at the base of the root. "Then you gotta pull it out, all at once, before the sap can bleed into the ground again." He didn't linger, offering only a slight nod before returning to his horse. "Jedediah Stone," he said, his name a quiet murmur carried on the breeze, before mounting and riding off, leaving Elara with the sharp knife and a newly acquired, practical piece of wisdom. Jedediah Stone. The name was spoken with a certain respect in Redemption Creek, a man known for his skill with horses and his ability to survive in the wilder territories. His brief, unsolicited help was surprising. It wasn't charity. It was a simple exchange of knowledge, born from a shared understanding of the land's demands. The encounter left Elara with a mingled sense of gratitude and a renewed sense of determination. The root, cut clean, indeed came free. It was a small victory, but a tangible one. The land she was learning demanded respect, knowledge, and persistent effort, and Jedediah Stone, in his quiet way, had acknowledged the truth of that. The unseen labor continued, but now there was a subtle shift in Elara's perception. She wasn't just fighting against the decay, she was actively working with the land, coaxing life and order from its wild heart. A process that required not just strength, but an understanding that was slowly, painstakingly beginning to dawn. The small patch of earth Elara had designated for her garden lay barren and sun-baked. It was a testament to the harshness of the climate, a challenging canvas for her burgeoning hopes. Agnes MacGregor's journal offered guidance on drought-resistant crops and methods for conserving water, but the sheer effort of preparing the ground felt daunting. The soil was compacted, lacking the rich dark loam Elara remembered from her childhood, a memory now fading like an old photograph. She began by clearing it of stones, a back-breaking task that left her hands blistered and her muscles screaming in protest. Each rock removed felt like a victory, a small act of defiance against the unyielding earth. She then turned the soil over, breaking up the clods with her shovel and a heavy hoe, her movements deliberate and methodical. She worked in the cooler hours of the morning and late afternoon, seeking refuge from the midday sun in the relative shade of the cabin. Agnes's journal mentioned the importance of enriching the soil with whatever organic matter could be found. Elara diligently collected dried grasses, animal droppings she found scattered on the prairie, carefully dried and aged as Agnes advised, and any scraps of vegetation she could salvage. She painstakingly incorporated these materials into the soil, a slow process of building fertility from the ground up. It was a labor of faith, trusting that her efforts would eventually yield results. One sweltering afternoon, as Elara was meticulously watering the prepared plot using water, carried in buckets from a stream several miles away, she saw Jedediah Stone approaching again. This time, he carried something slung over his shoulder. He stopped at the edge of her property, his eyes scanning the small cleared patch of land. "Figured you might need these," he said, his voice devoid of preamble. He gestured with his chin towards the object he carried. It was a large, sturdy wooden barrel, its sides weathered but intact, with a rudimentary pump mechanism attached. "Got it from an old prospector who was leaving the territory. Good for hauling water. Holds more than buckets, and this pump makes it easier to distribute." Elara's eyes widened. It was a generous and practical gift, one that would significantly ease the burden of her water collection. "Mr. Stone, that's very kind of you. I don't know how to thank you." He shrugged, a subtle movement that conveyed a lack of expectation. "Just saw you haul in water. Figured it was a waste of good effort. Every drop counts out here." He walked over to the plot and surveyed her work. "You're planting something, I see." "I hope to," Elara replied, her voice tinged with a mix of hope and trepidation. "Some beans, corn, maybe a few hardy vegetables, if the land allows." Jedediah nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Needs a bit more," he said, gesturing to the soil. "The earth here is thin, needs to be worked deep. And when you plant, try to dig a good wide hole, give the roots room to spread." He then looked towards the horizon, his gaze distant. "Best time to plant these kinds of seeds is just after the first good rain. The soil holds the moisture then." He helped her maneuver the heavy barrel closer to the cabin, the pump mechanism positioned within easy reach. It was an act of quiet solidarity, a gesture that spoke volumes in a world where words were often scarce. Elara watched him go, a strange warmth spreading through her, a feeling distinct from the heat of the sun. It was the warmth of recognition, of shared understanding, of knowing that she was not entirely invisible in this vast landscape. The following days saw Elara sowing her seeds. She followed Jedediah's advice, digging wide, deep holes and carefully placing each precious seed. She nurtured the tiny plot with the water from the new barrel. Each drop felt like a prayer. She sat by the garden each morning, her eyes scanning the disturbed earth, willing life to emerge. Then one morning, after a night of gentle, life-giving rain, Elara saw it. Tiny green shoots, impossibly delicate, were pushing their way through the soil. It was a miracle, a testament to persistence, and a glimmer of hope made visible. The garden, once a symbol of her ambition and the land's resistance, was now a vibrant promise of sustenance, a tangible sign that even in the most barren places, life, with enough care and unwavering faith, could find a way to bloom. The small garden, a patchwork of nascent green, brought a new dimension to Elara's solitary existence. The daily ritual of tending to the fragile sprouts offered a much-needed distraction from the pervasive loneliness and the daunting scale of the cabin's restoration. Yet, with the emergence of new life, the past, like a persistent shadow, seemed to lengthen and grow more insistent. One afternoon, as Elara was carefully weeding around the young bean plants, she noticed a rider approaching from the direction of Redemption Creek. It wasn't Jedediah. The horse and rider were unfamiliar. As they drew closer, she recognized the stern, weathered face of a man named Jedediah, the town's undertaker, and a man known for his dour disposition and his equally dour pronouncements. He was a repository of local history, often dispensing it in hushed, ominous tones. He reined his horse in at the edge of her property, his eyes fixing on the cabin, then on the small garden. His gaze held a distinct disapproval, a silent judgment that made Elara's spine stiffen. "Settling in, are we?" he drawled, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Never thought I'd see anyone trying to make a home out here, especially not at the old McGregor place." Elara met his gaze, her hands resting on her hoe. "I'm making it work, Mr. Jedediah." "Work?" He let out a short, humorless chuckle. "This it's got a history, ma'am. A sad one. Agnes McGregor, she was a good woman, but this land, It broke her spirit. Drove her mad, some say. Her husband before her went west looking for gold and never came back. Just left her with nothing. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Folks around here, they don't forget. They say the land remembers. Elara felt a familiar surge of frustration mixed with a growing unease. Mr. Jedediah, I found Agnes's journal. She wrote of hardship, of loneliness, but nothing more. The only spirit here is the spirit of survival. Maybe so, he conceded, though his tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it. But survival ain't always enough. This cabin, it's seen its share of sorrow. Best not to stir up what's buried. He looked at her intently. You alone out here. It ain't safe. And some might say, it ain't wise to try and cultivate something on ground that's known so much pain. With that cryptic warning, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Elara with a disquieting sense of dread. The whispers of the town, previously dismissed as superstitious gossip, now felt more potent, tinged with the undertones of genuine concern, or perhaps something darker. The cabin's past, the sorrowful tales of Agnes and her vanished husband, seemed to press in on her, threatening to suffocate the fragile hope she had nurtured. Later that evening, by the dim light of her oil lamp, Elara reread passages from Agnes's journal. Agnes wrote of her husband's departure, of the gnawing uncertainty that followed, and the increasing isolation that became her constant companion. There was no mention of madness or spectral visitations, only the profound ache of abandonment and the physical toil of trying to maintain a life alone. Agnes's descriptions of the land's harshness, of the wind that howled like a banshee and the sun that beat down relentlessly, seemed to confirm Elara's own experiences. It wasn't a malevolent force but a powerful, indifferent one. The encounter with Mr. Jedediah had planted a seed of doubt. Was she merely being stubborn, ignoring genuine warnings, or was she allowing the ingrained superstitions of the frontier to cloud her own judgment? She looked out at the dark, silent landscape, the stars glinting like cold, distant eyes. The weight of Agnes's past, coupled with the town's collective unease, felt like a heavy cloak settling upon her shoulders. The resilience she had found within herself now had to contend not just with the elements, but with the insidious power of history and the fear it could instill. The labor of rebuilding the cabin had suddenly become a battle against more than just rot and decay. It was a struggle against the ghosts of memory, both real and imagined. Jedediah Stone remained a distant, enigmatic presence in Elara's life. He appeared sporadically, a fleeting silhouette against the vast horizon, never lingering, never demanding, but always observing. His presence, though infrequent, was a constant, a silent acknowledgement of her struggle that, paradoxically, felt more substantial than the townspeople's gossip. He would ride by, sometimes at a distance, sometimes closer, his gaze sweeping over her work. Elara learned to recognize the rhythm of his horse's hooves, the particular way he sat in the saddle. He never intruded, never offered unsolicited advice, but his presence felt like a silent anchor, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. One particularly blustery afternoon, as Elara was struggling to secure a loose shutter on the cabin, a sudden gust of wind ripped it from her grasp, sending it clattering precariously. Before she could react, Jedediah was there. He had appeared as if summoned by the wind itself, dismounting with his usual quiet efficiency. He caught the shutter before it could do further damage, and with a few swift, practiced movements secured it firmly. "Wind's got a mind of its own today," he commented, his voice a low rumble as he stepped back. He surveyed the cabin, his eyes taking in the patched roof, the reinforced walls, the nascent garden struggling against the elements. "You've done good work here." The compliment, so understated and matter-of-fact, felt more significant than any effusive praise. Elara felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thank you, Mr. Stone, I'm trying my best." "Best is all any of us can do," he replied, his gaze lingering on the garden. "Those beans look like they're gonna make it." "They are," Elara said, a flicker of pride in her voice. "Thanks to some advice I received." She hesitated, then decided to be direct. "You know, Mr. Stone, folks in town, they talk about the cabin, about me. They say it's not a good place." Jedediah's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that transcended mere observation. He ran a calloused thumb along the worn leather of his glove. "Townsfolk talk. It's what they do. They see what's on the surface. They don't always see the strength it takes to build something from nothing." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the distant mountains. "This land ain't cursed, ma'am. It's just demanding. It asks for a lot. But it gives back too if you know how to listen." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer further explanations. He simply presented his perspective, a counterpoint to the ingrained superstitions of Redemption Creek. He didn't dismiss her struggles, nor did he offer false comfort. He acknowledged the demand of the land, and in doing so, he validated her efforts. As he prepared to ride off, he paused. "If you ever need a hand with anything bigger than a shutter," he said, his gaze meeting hers for a brief, intense moment, "don't hesitate to send word. I'm usually out this way, work in the North Range." He gestured vaguely towards the rugged terrain beyond her property. Elara watched him go, the offer hanging in the air, a quiet lifeline. It wasn't pity, nor was it romantic interest. It was a simple, practical offer of assistance from one solitary individual to another, a recognition of shared challenges in a harsh environment. His observation wasn't just about the physical structure of the cabin or the struggling garden. It was about the unseen labor, the resilience Elara embodied. Jedediah Stone, the quiet cowboy, saw not a woman trying to tame a cursed place, but an individual carving out her own destiny with grit and determination. And in his silent observation, he saw something truly valuable, something that went beyond the broken cabin and the dusty land. He saw her. The days grew longer, the sun's rays becoming more intense, but the young plants in Elara's garden had responded to the initial nurturing and the timely rains. The tiny green shoots had unfurled into sturdy stalks, their leaves a vibrant testament to life's tenacious hold. The bean plants, thick and bushy, were beginning to show the first delicate blossoms. The corn, though still short, stood proud, its tassels whispering in the breeze. Even the small patch of hardy root vegetables was showing promising growth beneath the soil. This burgeoning success brought a new kind of energy to Elara's days. The garden was no longer just a symbol of hope. It was becoming a tangible source of sustenance. The physical labor of tending to it was demanding, but the reward was immeasurable. Each day she would inspect her plants with a mixture of pride and anxiety, checking for signs of pests or disease, ensuring they had enough water. The barrel and pump Jedediah had gifted her were indispensable, allowing her to water more efficiently, a task that had previously consumed hours of her day. One sweltering afternoon, as Elara was carefully tying up a particularly vigorous bean vine, she heard the familiar sound of Jedediah's horse. He rode up to the edge of the garden, his gaze immediately drawn to the rows of thriving plants. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Well now," he said, his voice softer than usual, a hint of admiration in its tone. "Looks like you've coaxed a miracle out of this dirt." Elara felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the sun. "It's come along better than I expected," she admitted, her own smile mirroring his. "The advice you gave me about digging deep and wide, it made a difference. And the barrel, it's been a godsend." Jedediah dismounted, walking slowly along the perimeter of the garden, his boots sinking slightly into the newly turned soil. He didn't offer advice this time, simply observed, his presence a quiet validation of her efforts. He picked up a fallen leaf, turning it over in his fingers, his expression one of deep respect for the natural world. "This land," he said, his voice thoughtful, "it doesn't give up its bounty easily. You gotta earn it. You've earned this." He gestured to the garden. "It's a good start. A real good start." His words were simple, but they resonated deeply within Elara. They were a recognition of her hard work, her perseverance, and her connection to the land. It was more than just a compliment. It was an acknowledgement of her place, her struggle, and her burgeoning success. As the days progressed, the first fruits of her labor began to ripen. The beans swelled on their pods, plump and green. The corn stalks, now tall and proud, showed the first signs of developing ears. Elara, her heart brimming with a mixture of joy and trepidation, harvested her first basket of vegetables. It wasn't a large harvest, but it was hers. It was the tangible result of weeks of sweat, toil, and unwavering hope. She prepared a simple meal that evening, consisting of fresh beans and corn, seasoned with the herbs she'd found in the cabin. The taste was unlike anything she had ever experienced, fresh, vibrant, and imbued with the satisfaction of her own accomplishment. As she ate, sitting by the window, Watching the twilight paint the sky in soft hues, she felt a profound sense of peace. The cabin was still a work in progress, its walls not yet fully repaired, its comforts few. But the garden, her small patch of cultivated life, was a beacon. It was proof that with dedication and a willingness to learn, even the most unpromising circumstances could yield abundance. The harvest was more than just food. It was a symbol of her resilience, a testament to her ability to not just survive, but to thrive. And as the stars began to emerge, Elara Vance knew that her journey in this unforgiving land was just beginning, but she was no longer just an inheritor of dust and dreams. She was a cultivator of life. The success of her small garden brought a newfound sense of accomplishment to Elara, a quiet confidence that began to permeate her days. The cabin, though still far from complete, felt more like a home, its interior slowly being cleared and repaired, its windows gradually being replaced with salvaged panes that offered glimpses of the outside world. The rhythm of her life was now intertwined with the cycles of nature, her days dictated by the needs of her plants and the ongoing restoration of her dwelling. However, this burgeoning sense of peace was soon to be tested by an unseen force, one that originated not from the land itself, but from the very community she was trying to become a part of. The whispers in Redemption Creek, which had momentarily subsided with Elara's determined efforts, began to resurface, taking on a more pointed and unsettling tone. It started subtly. A few more lingering glances when she visited the general store, a hushed conversation that immediately ceased when she approached. Then came the small acts of what felt like deliberate obstruction. A fence post she had painstakingly repaired was found mysteriously loosened. A small pile of firewood she had stacked neatly near the cabin was scattered. These were not acts of vandalism, but rather minor annoyances, designed to sow seeds of doubt and perhaps encourage her to leave. One evening, as Elara was returning from fetching water from the stream, she found her mule, Patience, agitated. The animal was skittish, whinnying nervously, and it took considerable effort for Elara to calm her. As she examined Patience, she noticed a small, almost imperceptible scratch on the mule's flank, as if something sharp had been deliberately brushed against her. It was a minor injury, easily tended, but the intent behind it sent a chill down Elara's spine. The next day, when she rode into town for supplies, Silas, the general store owner, seemed unusually withdrawn. His usual polite, albeit probing demeanor was replaced by a hesitant reluctance. "Heard there's been some trouble out your way," he offered vaguely, avoiding her direct gaze as he tallied her purchases. Elara met his eyes, her own gaze steady. "I've had a few minor setbacks, Mr. Silas. Nothing I can't handle." Silas sighed, a weary sound. "It's just, some folks are worried about you being out there alone, and well, they say that land has a way of pushing people away, especially those who try to change it." He glanced nervously towards the back of his store, as if expecting someone to overhear. "Jedediah Stone, he ain't said much, but even he's been looking that way more often than usual, almost like he's watching for something." Elara's heart sank. The unease she had felt after Jedediah's offer of help now felt amplified. Was he not just observing her resilience, but also watching for signs of danger, as if her presence was a prelude to some inevitable conflict? Or was Silas misinterpreting his concerned glances? Later that week, a more direct incident occurred. While Elara was working in her garden, she heard the distinct sound of a horse approaching, not with Jedediah's steady gait, but with a more aggressive, thundering pace. A rider, cloaked and with his face obscured by the brim of his hat, rode up to the edge of her property, stopping just beyond the reach of her garden. He didn't speak, but instead, with a deliberate, menacing gesture, he threw a small, crudely made effigy made of straw and rags onto her land near the cabin door. It landed with a soft thud in the dust, a silent, chilling threat. Elara froze, her blood running cold. This was no longer just a few whispers or minor annoyances. This was a deliberate act of intimidation, designed to instill fear. The cabin, which she had painstakingly worked to make her sanctuary, now felt vulnerable, exposed. The shadows of the dust, which had once represented the past she was overcoming, now seemed to gather with a new malevolent purpose, The labor of building a home had suddenly taken a darker turn, forcing Elara to confront the possibility that her struggle for survival in this rugged land would involve more than just the elements. It would involve confronting the darker aspects of human nature, personified by the shadows lurking just beyond the light. The effigy lay on the dust near Elara's cabin door, a crude, silent accusation. It was a stark, unsettling intrusion into the fragile peace she had painstakingly cultivated. Elara stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs, a mixture of fear and defiance warring within her. This was no longer about mere gossip or passive disapproval. This was a direct, menacing message. She retrieved the straw figure, her hands trembling slightly, and carried it out to the edge of her property, far from the cabin and her garden. She didn't burn it, as rage might have dictated, but simply placed it on the ground, a silent rejection of its intended purpose. It was a small act of control, a refusal to let the fear it represented take root within her. The incident, however, had a profound effect. Elara found herself scanning the horizon more frequently, her senses on high alert. Every distant rider, every rustle in the brush, sent a jolt of apprehension through her. The solace she had found in the quiet solitude of her land was now tinged with a new wariness. The cabin, which had begun to feel like a sanctuary, now seemed more exposed, more vulnerable. Despite her heightened anxiety, Elara refused to let the act deter her. She continued her daily routines, her determination hardening. If anything, the intimidation only fueled her resolve to make this place her own. She reinforced the cabin's main door with an extra bar, fashioned from a sturdy piece of salvaged wood. She began to keep a heavy iron poker close at hand, a modest but tangible sense of preparedness. Jedediah Stone's presence, which had previously offered a quiet form of reassurance, now carried a more complex weight.